So thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon to the 13th annual Norman R. Seay lecture. My name is John Morris, and I have the privilege and the honor of being the director of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which is hosting this Norman R. Seay lecture. Let me just go through a few housekeeping details. First, if you would take your devices and put them on mute or turn them off, that would be much appreciated. Second, the necessary rooms, if you go out either of the two exits and turn to your right, both the men's and ladies' room are just across the hall. Those who may have driven here and parked in one of the garages, there will be a table outside in the lobby that will validate your parking ticket if you have it. So please see the individuals there to get that validated. In your packet, you should find an evaluation form, and we're most interested in having you complete that at the end of the lecture today so that we can improve future lectures. And there will be a reception immediately following the lecture, again, just outside in the lobby. Now, let me indicate that the reception is sponsored by two of our partners. The first is Links Incorporated. It's a prestigious international volunteer service organization comprised of professional women of color. And there are 3 chapters in St. Louis. We are with the St. Louis chapter today. And also the auxiliary to the Mound City Medical Forum. The forum was founded in 1939. The auxiliary also is a volunteer service organization made up of spouses of the physicians of color. The name Mound City may sound peculiar, but prior to the pioneers that came and colonized this area, this was a big area of Native Americans for mound builders. Matter of fact, we have a national Cahokia mounds just across the river. And so the city was full of Indian mounds, and they're all gone now, but it's called Mound City. I'd like to offer 2 certificates of appreciation to Mary Thomas, who is here. Mary is the president of the auxiliary of the Mound City Medical Forum and a Links member. So will you join me in thanking her? I should say that Mary also is a member of our African American Advisory Board. Many members of the board are here as well, and thanks to all of them. And thanks as well to the members of the Seay Lecture Planning Committee. I'm not going to name them all, but they're in your program for today. Now, hosting the Seay Lecture requires a good amount of planning and a great amount of work. I want to thank everyone affiliated with the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center because many, many people have contributed to this, but I particularly want to thank Andre Denny, Murtis Spencer, Jennifer Phillips, Kristen Stock, and Krista Mulder. They did a great job putting all this together. Let's thank them. So we're delighted to have today the Dean of the Washington University School of Medicine, David H. Perlmutter. He is also the Executive Vice Chancellor for Medical Affairs. He came back to Washington University to assume the deanship in 2015. He'd previously been a faculty member here before he went to Pittsburgh, where he was the chair of pediatrics. We've been delighted to have him back, and he's going to welcome us all. Let's welcome Dean Perlmutter.
Well, it is really an honor for me to welcome all of you today, and as you might imagine, there are a lot of lectures here and a lot of named lectures, and I would probably have to spend all of my time welcoming and giving remarks if I was going to do this. So there is something very special about my being here today, and that has to do with recognizing what's happening here right now, recognizing the great work that John Morris has done in leading the ADRC for so many years, and in the contribution that Norman Seay has made as an advocate for the community on the board that is so important to what we do. But also because this event recognizes two of the deepest and most urgent commitments of this medical school and academic medical center. We have the benefit of having the finest Alzheimer's disease research at Washington University School of Medicine, in my opinion, in the world. And it is deep, and it is broad, and it is, has the potential, has already made so many important advances and has the potential to have such an impact. And there's not a one of us here who this disease has not touched in one way or another. We are deeply committed to making more of an impact on this problem going forward. And then lastly, because this represents the heart and soul of our commitment to improving on diversity and inclusion, both with respect to how we deliver care and how we have an impact on the communities here in St. Louis, the African American communities, and the African American communities all over that are affected in a devastating way by this condition. I just want to mention we're very lucky today to have a new member of our faculty and our leadership, Dr. Cherie Wilson, who joined us as of October 1st as our new Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And Cherie, if you would just stand up so that everybody can see you. We care deeply about doing something about Alzheimer's disease and doing something about how it affects the African American community. So welcome, and thank you so much for participating with us today.
Thanks so much, David. I will just very briefly give you the background for why there is a Norman R. Seay lecture. My mentor and the founding director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here at Washington University, Leonard Berg, stepped down from the directorship in 1997. And as I took over the leadership, it was apparent to me that we had very few research participants other than non-Hispanic white individuals. And I'm not very smart, but I recognize that if we study this terrible illness only in one segment of our population, we'll learn things, but we won't know if they apply to other segments of the population. And here in St. Louis, the largest underrepresented group is African American. And so I turned to a son of one of my patients, Norman Seay, who has a distinguished record of, as an educator, but also as a civil rights activist in St. Louis, and asked him in 2000 to form an African American advisory board to help us be more welcoming to people of color in our research studies. And Norman formed a terrific board that has been, since 2000, extremely influential and helpful in our work. As a matter of fact, in 2000, the percentage of African American research volunteers in our studies was under 3%, and now it is, with the help of the board, now 18%, which is the percentage of African Americans in our metropolitan statistical region. So Norman was terrific, very influential, In 2006, he had a small stroke, and he thankfully recovered, but he relinquished the chairmanship of the African American Advisory Board. He still remains a member, and many of our board members will testify he not only is a member, he is a vocal and engaged member. But unfortunately, in the past couple months, he has had a little bit of a downturn in his health, and he is unable to join us today. And I just spoke with him this morning. He's as disappointed as we are that he can't be here, but he sends his best regards and hopes to join us next year for the 14th Seay lecture. So here's a photo of Norman. Maybe we can have the lights down. And so we miss him being here today. So let's get going. We are delighted to have two preeminent Seay lecturers today. The first is a St. Louis native, Joy Ballsbury. She was educated at Xavier University in Louisiana, then here for a time at Washington University, then at the University of Toledo and the University of Florida. She now is at Mayo Clinic as a psychiatric epidemiologist and health educator. Part of her research portfolio is examining best approaches for the inclusion of diverse populations in health research. The title of her presentation today is Silent Voices, Increasing Minority Engagement in Alzheimer's Disease Research. Let's welcome Dr. Ballsbury. With you at the end, we'll have a photograph.
Okay.
This advances.
Okay.
That's a winner.
Okay. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. How you doing today? Okay, so I'm not that typical scientist speaker. I like to engage the audience, and so we blame that on my parents. And those of you that knew my father, James Balls, he was very charismatic, and so I'd ask you all to give a thumbs up for him. And so, and thumbs up to the Seay Center for sponsoring today's event. So thank you again, Dr. Morris, and to the planning team and Mrs. Spencer, and then to some of my mother's close girlfriends in the Links, and to my sorority sisters in Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and I can go on and name all of the groups that are here and present. So it is good to be home. So today, the title of my talk is Silent Voices, Increasing Minority Engagement in Alzheimer's Disease Research. So I don't have any disclosures yet, but maybe one day I will, but right now I don't. So let's pray for those disclosures one day. So our plan today is we are going to review the impact of being silent on our health, review the dementia spectrum, as many of us call it, and we are also going to recognize ways that we can actively engage in healthcare research. And then at the end, I have a task for you, and that task is I'm going to call you to action, so I have a dare for you at the very end. So I'd like to start my address with a brief quote that's here. And it's from one of my favorite guys, my other favorite guy is sitting in the audience, and the other one is in Washington, D.C., my big brother. So my father said that blacks don't tend to go to the doctor that much. They think they're all right. They'll say, I have a headache, and it's not a headache, you know. I'll be all right tomorrow. This quote is from an interview that I did with my father back in 2015 before we published a scientific paper together and before he was diagnosed with a rare form of bladder cancer. In our family, health was always a major topic. We had this open door policy about talking about wellness and what we needed to do to stay healthy. So at the time that I did this interview in January 2015, we had no idea that about a year and a half, almost 2 years later, he wouldn't be with us. So I am thankful that I had the opportunity to record him while he was still well. So in preparing for this, I thought about the fact that many of my friends and family members tend to be silent about the things that impact our health, from Alzheimer's to cardiovascular disease to breast cancer, but we know that there are some things that we can do to modify our risk factors for many of these diseases in terms of the lifestyles that we live. But then there's also the hereditary factors that also impact our health. So we need to be open to having a dialogue about those things so that we know how to increase our wellness. So this picture here is of my parents and their best friends. So there's only two guys in the photo from that New Year's Eve. It's probably around 1978, 79, or 80. And the two guys in the photos were best friends. The one in the center, the little short dude, that's my dad, James. And the tall guy is Ronald Bolin. And for those of you all that know Ronald, his wife is here, my Aunt Fanny Bolin. So I'd like to thank her for pulling this out of the family archives for me. So my dad met Ronald probably when they were about 12 years old, and they met over a bicycle. So the story goes that my dad had this green bicycle, and Ronald had just asked his parents for the same type of bicycle, but hadn't gotten one yet, and my dad let him ride the bicycle. And then my dad was telling Ronald stories about this girl that he knew from church, and that girl was my Aunt Fanny, and that's how they ended up meeting. And Ronald was also instrumental in introducing my parents. So I grew up with this very diverse family that had multiple areas of opportunity that I could go into career-wise. My Uncle Ronald was an entrepreneur, so I knew about his work in entrepreneurialism and changing the urban landscape of St. Louis. And my father was in public health. I really didn't know what that meant until after I became an epidemiologist. We won't go there, but those things in life sometimes happen. So unfortunately, my Uncle Ronald was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And when we found out, we were like, oh gosh, what does this mean? This was not my area of research. This was not my father's. My father was also a biologist. Some of you all probably didn't know that as well. So that was not in his area of research either. And they started talking about what can we do. So one of the things that my Uncle Ronald actively did, and my father actually sat on the board at WashU at the time, was they got involved with research studies. Because he and my Aunt Fanny felt it was very important that we have a dialogue with other African Americans that did not have a family history of this disease to start that conversation. And so, so today I dedicate this talk to both of them. So we know that our population is growing. By 2030, we'll go from 35 million Americans aged 65 and or older to 70 million. So with this increase in our senior population, we know that the risk of disease prevention and the impact of health will also change. Chronic health concerns become a major impact, patient action, and that means adherence and compliance, and our ability to improve our health and act on recommendations from our healthcare teams is also a major role in whether or not we have wellness and quality of life. This also relates directly to our access to care and our ability to receive the services that we need in order to stay healthy and maintain an active quality of life. These things also, as we age, as we are at risk for other diseases, then we might be at more risk for diseases of aging. And I like to call them a spectrum of diseases. But one of the things that we really need to think about is how do we screen for these diseases early before somebody is really at risk or diagnosed? What are the best treatment outcomes? And what can we do to make sure that the patient, as well as their caregivers, have the best quality of life? So, for clarity's sake, I mentioned a brief story about my family's history with Alzheimer's disease, and this is something that may not impact some of you in the room. Normal aging is what we all wish for, but this is not something that we all will be able to achieve. So there are many factors that will impact us and those that we love as we age. As I learn more about diseases of aging, I like to think of them in a way like this picture diagram shows. Many times they are not necessarily interconnected, and one disease might not lead to another, but there is a continuity and I can't say that word today, one of them days. See, y'all making me nervous because it's all my family member in the audience. So there is a continuum that exists in the way that I like to think of it. Normal aging happens, then we live our life as we're going, and we do what my grandfather, who was a funeral director and mortician, would say, we live our dash, that time from birth to death. And we're excited about those moments. But this does not necessarily mean that we will be free from all disease, but it's like that natural course until that final transition. And then we also have what one of my colleagues, Dr. Ron Peterson at Mayo Clinic, termed mild cognitive impairment. And this is a condition that is demonstrated when an individual shows cognitive or mental or intellectual deficiencies in activities of daily living. From the research that we've conducted at Mayo Clinic, we noted that there were two main forms. It may be the first cognitive expression of Alzheimer's disease, or it may be secondary to other diseases. And we also know the prevalence, so the overall impact of that disease, impacts 6 to 25% of adults between the ages of 60 to 84 years of age. Dementia, which I have on the bottom, is a decline in cognitive function and memory. The diagnosis leads to loss of independence for the person living with the disease. It changes their quality of life, and it impacts those that love them and those that they love. It's also a very complex healthcare and illness, and the complexity of our healthcare system does not always make it easy on the loved ones. In early research on mild cognitive impairment, it was determined that the incidence of new diagnosis of dementia was nearly 15% for those 65 years of age or for over a 2-year period. And there was even some hope with those diagnosed early with dementia, as well as mild cognitive impairment, that looked at exercising as being a way to increase their cognitive ability. In 2006, it was found that 26 million people were living with some form of Alzheimer's disease. And during that time, $156 billion was spent worldwide on dementia. By 2050, we'll have 1 in 85 people living with dementia, with over 40% needing nursing care. So the disparities in diseases of aging are even worse in minority communities. This means going back to the basic, finding ways to diagnose people earlier, thinking about our cultural landscape when we're developing health interventions, thinking about ways that we can engage communities, patients, and caregivers. Because we want to make sure that we use a process that's appropriate for all of us. So let's talk a little bit about African American health, as well as research that's been done on us, not necessarily with us. So there were some studies that suggest that African Americans were more likely to develop dementia than our white counterparts. However, when studies were done on autopsies, it was mixed results. But we do know that African Americans are at greater risk for vascular disease, and vascular disease puts us at greater risk for vascular dementia. So there's this connection here, even though in autopsy studies, they had mixed results. So some studies were being done on African Americans over time that looked at genetics, our history of strokes and cardiovascular disease, as well as vascular dementia, non-vascular causes, and even selected demographic characteristics that might impact our development of dementia. So as you're thinking about biomedical research and healthcare research, I want you to keep some things in mind. There are historical underpinnings of unethical research. So I never do a talk to a lay audience without acknowledging the fact that we do have history. And this is one of the reasons I became a scientist, because we have to change the voice at the table. So we know that slaves were used involuntarily to participate in health research. We also know that after the Civil War, which is the post-antebellum period, and Dr. Boyd, hopefully I didn't mess that up, So my god brother who's here, who's a historian, so hopefully I didn't mess that up. So the post-antebellum period, there were over 400 African Americans, nearly 500. I believe the actual number was 470 African American men participated in the Tuskegee syphilis trials. And the trials went on with these black men even when a cure for syphilis was found, because the researchers wanted to look at the natural course of the disease. Then, guess what? My hometown was not exempt either. So do any of you all remember the Cold War test? What were the Cold War tests? Because again, remember, I like to engage the audience. Yeah, say it louder, Dr. Boyd. So when chemical warfare was going to be used by our military, they picked certain communities, many of which were poor black communities, and they sprayed chemicals in those communities. This happened in the mid-1950s here in St. Louis, Missouri. And guess what? No one knew. So in the area, for those of you all that are from St. Louis, this happened near the Peabody Projects. So in downtown St. Louis. So in 2012, there was a report that was given that highlighted this. But guess what? We have some protections in place that I want you all to know about and why you should still participate in research despite the unethical treatment. So let's move forward. So moving forward, I like to say we need to recognize our past. We need to have some education on our past so that we can plan for the future, and this will give us hope to make changes. So acknowledging the past is just what I talked about. It's thinking about the syphilis experiments. It's thinking about those people that were impacted by the Cold War. It's thinking about our brothers and sisters that have been living with preventable diseases in order to find cures for them in a way that impacts our health. This is about thinking about the protections that we now need to have in place, which we're now doing. So Washington University, Mayo Clinic, St. Louis University, the National Institutes of Health, I can keep going on and on. All of us have ethics boards. All of us make sure that we are protecting those that are giving to us to increase health. That means providing education. That means being systematic in our approaches. That means giving you all and me, the scientists, a way to actively engage so that we can connect to improve the health of our communities and not be silent anymore. From the hope stance, the National Institutes of Health, I believe it, and Dr. Hill, you can correct me if I misspoke on the date, but I believe it was 1994 that the Revitalization Act first came out. It was either 93 or 94. And that act was put into place to say that all biomedical research needed to include women and minorities. So what that means by the inclusion of women and minorities, it was also revised several times. The last time it was revised was in 2017, so last year. And so every few years they revitalized the act. The reason they put that in place was to say that the drugs that we were creating, the devices that we were creating, the health research trials that we were creating, and all of these other things needed to be culturally aware, needed to be ethical, and needed to have some things in place to ensure that the communities, that everyone wasn't able to participate as active stewards in the research process. I hope I'm speaking right, Dr. Morris. All right. So the other thing that we have is engagement, and this is one of my favorite areas. So community engaged and patient engaged researchers and community members allow for all of this to happen because guess what? You now have a voice at the table. So Dr. Morris mentioned the African American Advisory Board that you have. That board can speak to Dr. Morris and his team one-on-one to say, I think we need to do something about X, Y, and Z. And then Dr. Morris and his team can go out and seek some additional funding to possibly address that issue. So it's that power of the two coming together in a way that really actively improves health. He took over in 1997. I became a student at WashU in 1998. The first paper on community-based participatory research was published in 1998. And since 1997, when Dr. Morris has been in place, they've been community engaged. So now we have to think about that in terms of our community in St. Louis. We need to get other places actively engaged here. There are multiple universities. I suggest you call them researchers and tell them that you want to be involved. So precision medicine, also called individualized medicine, gives us the chance to think of the individual's need. What do they need for their health? What might work for me at 5 feet tall is not going to work for my husband at 6'3". 6'3". So we have to think about those things because, and then another thing, he's a guy, so he got different hormones than I have, and I got a lot of them right now because I'm a little hot. So moving forward, so we have to think about some other ways. So in my lab, we partnered with Cornell University Center for Clinical and Translational Science, and we did a literature review. So we took a whole bunch of articles and came up with some findings on how do we recruit minorities for clinical trials. And what we found is that it was very important, and we knew this, but some of our colleagues didn't, so you had to write a paper to say this is what y'all need to do, so that's what we did. So we found that we needed to partner more with community-based organizations and groups, including faith-based communities, and as a good Christian girl, I already knew that. We also needed to partner with civic and social and philanthropic groups, so I'm very thankful for my Mother's Link sisters being here and being a co-sponsor of this event, and my sorority sisters of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, I won't ski-wee, for you all being here too. And we also need to make sure that we use a community and patient engaged process that allows for feedback on all aspects of study design, implementation, and even dissemination. So when I publish my findings, I go back and I talk to my community partners and I say to them, this is what I think I'm seeing. Is this what I'm seeing? And they say, no, Joy, that ain't what you're seeing. You might be seeing this. And that allows me to make sure that I am protecting the cultural landscape of my study participants. I'm honoring the communities that they come from and their cultural heritage as well. We also need to do outreach to local healthcare providers and physicians, service providers that serve our community members and patients, and that we need to have research staff that come directly from the community. That is very, very important. You know, I can't stress that anymore. For those scientists in the room, make sure you build that into your budget. And then if your grants person says you don't have the money for it, find the money. Because it will make a difference in whether or not your study receives the patients that you want to engage. We also need to make sure that we have cultural brokers from the community to ensure that the cultural norms and values and the rules of the community are respected. And we also need to think about investing time and resources to build capacity of the research community. But the other factor that we need to think about that sometimes we don't discuss is literacy. This is also functional literacy, whether or not people can read or write, health literacy, whether or not they understand health information, and what I like to call research health literacy, which is do they understand what it means to be involved in a biomedical or health research study. So research is like living in a forest, and you get to play in the forest, and you come up with all these really cool things that you want to test, and it always has a framework. With community engaged research, it's about building relationships so that we can collaborate in a way and partner in a way that is protective of all that are being served by the research, the investigative team and their institution, as well as the patients and the community partners, with the overall goal of improving health. So this is, I'm going to call it the Boss-Berry theory on community engagement because I wrote it. So since I wrote it, that's what we're going to call it. So the community and patient engaged research theory really is a way that I train my students and my doctoral students and fellows on how we should do the research process. It is a process that I use in my lab. It allows us to think about what do we really want to do, what is our focus in terms of being clear, how do we build trust? This is being honest about our roles and expectations and determining ways to respect how each community partner and research partner will engage, respecting the cultural norms and values of each other. That means also telling our community partners how our academic institutions like to engage, because we all have processes that we need to go through. Having shared values, which is jointly determining the areas of focus, and also thinking about the outcome determination, which is related to our actions around the health topic, and even the time and the budget that we have in place for the research project. Having shared leadership, which is giving each partner equal say on the design, creation, and implementation of the project so that we can build sustainable relationships beyond just one activity. So we know that silence about our health impedes our wellness. As our society age, the prevalence of dementia spectrum diseases will increase. And this means that we need to have more research related to prevention, screening, and treatment for African Americans and other under-resourced communities, and that community and patient-engaged research provides an opportunity for us to foster bidirectional relationships with diverse communities. Our future directions at Mayo Clinic, we now have a partnership, a long-standing partnership with the University of Mississippi Medical Center. And this partnership was created to increase population-based studies on the clarity of the prevalence of diseases related to aging, to identify risk factors and biomarkers related to diseases of aging, and to really think about ways that we can expand opportunities to gain information from African Americans that were at risk, to create tools for primary and secondary and tertiary prevention. And so what we already have in place is that we have a large grant from the National Institutes of Health to do some population-based studies beyond Olmsted County, Minnesota, which is where I live, in Rochester, which is largely white. And we wanted to enhance the investigation of scientific questions around vascular disease as it relates to vascular dementia and mild cognitive impairment, and that we're now launching the Mississippi Mayo Study of Aging. And so this is my call to action to you. So I dare you to be determined to speak up about the things that matter to you as it relates to your health. I want you to raise awareness with others around you, because guess what? You have the power of your voice, the power of your pen, the power of your cell phone to reach out on Twitter, social media, email, pick up the phone and call somebody. I answer my own phone at Mayo. I do have a secretary, so it'll roll to her occasionally, but if I usually answer, when I've called Dr. Morris' office, he typically answers. So make sure you reach out to us. Give us insight on what's going on. Also, be realistic. It takes time and money to address certain things, and guess what? It takes a long time for us to get funding. So sometimes when you submit a grant to the National Institutes of Health, guess what? It don't get funded the first time, but it might get funded the second time, and then if it does get funded, when it does get funded, it might take you, 8 months? About 8 months for that money to get into your hands, and then another 4 months for you to get the study up and running. So that's a year. So you have to give us time just like we have to give you all time. And to remember to be actively engaged. So with that, I am hosting the Minority Women Research Network. This is part of my PCORI grant, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. We're hosting a symposium at Morehouse School of Medicine next week. So those of you all that are in the Atlanta area or will be near Atlanta and decide y'all want to drive over, guess what? It's free. It's open to the public. It's open to researchers. It's open to patients, caregivers, mamas, daddies, ministers, and the like. And we hope that you can join us on October 15th and 16th. And I'd like to thank a few people, Dr. Ron Peterson and Dr. Jonas Gaeta, for providing me some insight on helping me make sure that I wasn't going to misspeak about Alzheimer's and dementia. They're both at Mayo Clinic. Also, Washington, my alma mater, Washington University School of Medicine, the St. Louis chapter of the Links Incorporated, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, my husband and honeydew, Bernard Israel Berry, my mommy, and all of our families and friends, and lastly, Mound City Medical Society for all of your support over the years, even when I was a student here at WashU. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Joy. That was just wonderful. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Carl V. Hill. Carl was educated at Morehouse and then the University of Michigan. You notice with Joy in Minnesota and Carl from Michigan, there's a northern geographic emphasis. But since 2013, Carl has been director of the National Institute of Aging's Office of Special Population, where he heads efforts to address health disparities in biomedical research and, importantly, in its workforce. He's going to speak today on diversity in clinical trial recruitment, intention, omission, and the silence. Let's welcome Dr. Hill. We have a talk for you, and at the end, we'll take focus.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for that introduction. I tell you, and Dr. Balls-Berry for that very intriguing and enlightening presentation. Really good information there. It's certainly an honor to be here at Washington University and serve in this capacity at this Norman Seay lecture. I bring greetings from Drs. Richard Hodis, our director at the National Institute on Aging, and Dr. Marie A. Bernard, who are both keenly interested in ways to improve the recruitment and retention of African Americans in aging research broadly and Alzheimer's research specifically. I also acknowledge my NIA colleagues in the room. I think I saw Dr. Cerise Elliott and Dr. Nina Silverberg right down in front. Good to be here. Any other NIA colleagues here? Okay, thanks for being here. And a couple of my friends and colleagues and quite a few Butler Williams scholars here in the room. Hands up, yes, Butler Williams scholars, yes, the gang is here, yes. I brought them as backup just in case you don't like what I say, so it can help me get out of here if things don't go right. So I was in Mississippi a couple months ago and at Jackson State giving a talk. And I took several routes to get to some points about it was men's health and receiving funding from NIH. And knowing that I'm from a historically black college, Morehouse, one of the veteran, professors that was there in the audience came up to me after the talk. He says, "Carl, thanks for the information. It was nice. I really enjoyed it, but you got to get to the points faster. Okay, get to it." He said, "We just don't have all day, Carl, right?" So I'm going to take some sound advice from my community, which is very important, and I'll start with the main points. Okay, so point one, diversity in Alzheimer's research is fundamental to protecting public health. And this diversity should be evident, right, among researchers, program coordinators, study participants, and the program officers and staff back at the NIA that administer support. The Alzheimer's disease research field needs and deserves input and participation from various groups, including African Americans in St. Louis. So one of the important frameworks to help with this inclusion, I think, is the work of Dr. Peggy Dilworth Anderson, whose framework is very similar to Dr. Balls-Berry's framework at the UNC School of Public Health. Dr. Dilworth Anderson has been a keynote speaker previously for this very important event, wonderful event. And as we see in the slide, outlines several important factors for this landmark work, ranging from valuing cultural distinctions to building trust and having adequate resources, including money to do this right, which is where the NIA comes into this picture. My second point is that researchers, study coordinators, and program officers back at NIA should be intent on setting up benchmarks, right, for including diverse populations into this research from the very beginning of the planning process. Exclusion criteria should reflect this commitment, meaning that leaving people out of the recruitment process should be linked to sound scientific rationale, not merely reflecting challenges to developing cultural awareness, sensitivity, and appropriateness. But as we know, and probably one of the many reasons that we're here today, these benchmarks are often missed, leaving plans incomplete, intentions unrealized, and agreements unkept. I want to spend my time here today discussing how I think these shortcomings develop, and in honor of heroes like Norman Seay, Peggy Dilworth Anderson, Marie Bernard, my deputy director, and Joyce Ballsbury, talk a bit about the voices of reason, fairness, and equity that must combat this silence. So a couple weeks ago, I was watching TV and I saw a very good documentary about Jane Fonda on HBO. Right? Did anyone catch that one on HBO? It's good, very good work. As we know, Jane is a well-known actress, daughter of Henry Fonda, really Hollywood royalty. And I thought it was well done because it shows how Jane was grappled early on in her life with identities of status and wealth and privilege and entitlement, and how this conflict led to her being a very engaged activist for equality, committing her life to being a voice around issues of fairness, dignity, and regard. Well, anyway, during the course of the show, there's a mention of Jane's ex-husband, billionaire business mogul Ted Turner, who's been in the news of late with the recent diagnosis of Lewy body dementia. We're certainly, our thoughts are with Ted and with his family. But at some point during this documentary, there's an older clip of Ted Turner discussing the merits of doing nothing when faced with a challenge in business, which he said, one, will never get you in trouble, but you will never get anywhere. So never get you in trouble, but you'll never get anywhere. So given Ted's stature as a powerful and successful leader of business operations, it made me ponder the effects of inaction or silence in the face of critical challenge. Put another way, when those accountable to the implementation of an initiative make a decision, conscious or unconscious, to do nothing when ideals or plans are unmet, can the initiative be successful? Can the initiative ever truly be complete? So back in Maryland at my own Office of Special Populations at NIA, we made this year some very small pilot research awards for health disparities research. And our original plan this year was to hold an in-person meeting with the awardees. We're going to bring the folks together so we could celebrate their awards. And we worked hard, I tell you. We made the awards, but we simply just ran out of time in the fiscal year to have the meeting. And while that is a valid explanation, I direct a very small office of 1 or 2 people. It still leaves our work incomplete and not fully successful. One approach is to acknowledge this head on, understand what went wrong, make plans to adjust and improve. Another approach is to simply celebrate what we were able to accomplish. pat ourselves on the back for making the research awards, which I think is a reason to be proud. It's always good when we support health disparities research at NIA and at NIH broadly, but to remain silent on the parts of the plan that we missed masks the fact that our ultimate success was not obtained. Means that we must hold ourselves accountable. We've got to hold ourselves accountable for what we did not complete. Well, as you see here in Dr. Dilworth Anderson's excellent framework for the science of recruitment and retention, acknowledging and respecting collective histories of populations, cities, states, is fundamental for successful outreach and engagement. I would also argue that there's a national history that is relevant for severe challenges of including African Americans into clinical research that considers Alzheimer's disease. You see, because I work for the US government, the federal government, I've been keenly interested in the history and function of the government and its original intention for a United States of America that prioritizes equality and unalienable rights for all. So I won't go too deep here into American history, but please indulge me for a couple of minutes. Is that okay? Can we go there for a minute? You stay with me? Okay. Well, the leaders of the revolutionary cohort, and we're talking about Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, and many others, held lofty intentions for a democracy that prioritized equality. A democracy that prioritized equality. This revolutionary generation visualized the country free of colonial rule, no indentured servants or people stuck in lower classes, where all men were created equal and free to various pursuits. Has there ever been a United States as originally intended? Well, the answer to this question led me to Mr. Joseph Ellis and his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Founding Brothers. Anyone read that one? Well, in it, there's a chapter titled The Silence, where Ellis describes the original American spirit and how this spirit has come to serve as a reminder and hold us accountable to America's truest original intent. Ellis also identifies a couple of obstacles and barriers to these intentions of equality and inclusion. First was an issue of operations and a need for a peasant class of people to labor and work the vast array of natural resources that this land had to offer. Tobacco, king cotton. Someone had to do the hard work, right? Manual labor and produce resources fast for this new country to start competing on a new world market. A second reason Ellis names that derailed plans of equality and inclusion linked to what I believe is steeped in human regard and human dignity. In the free enterprise of this new country during the Revolutionary era, in theory, any person here, regardless of status, was free to pursue a plot of land, develop the product, and engage in national and international trade. While the original spirit called for equity, this free enterprise bonanza demanded that a hierarchy be established and some exclusion criteria on who was deserving, on who would be regarded as human. Here in this slide, you see that this discussion devolved into sordid and inhumane classifications of people. Again, thanks for bearing with me on this almost ancient American history, but I do think it can be relevant to our discussion of African American recruitment and participation in Alzheimer's research. You see, the point is that something happened in between what was originally planned and what has been accomplished. And in his book, Joseph Ellis says that a major part of what happened was the third obstacle to the equality that the revolutionary cohort dreamed. It is that well-intended, moral people with revolutionary power chose to do nothing and stay silent about the most important ideal the Patriots fought and stood for. Silent on issues of American equality, human dignity, and human regard. Similar to the time when resources were plentiful at the beginning of the United States, we're in a revolutionary era of support for Alzheimer's disease research. This is important and a blessing, really, because many of our loved ones, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, godparents, neighbors, friends have developed this devastating disease that affects our families and communities. With help from the Alzheimer's Association, my colleagues are down here right in front, and other reliable partners, we at NIA have received millions of additional dollars from Congress to support this research. Like the free enterprise environment after the American Revolution, a vast number of researchers have used these resources to investigate areas like the biology of neurodegeneration, genetics, caregiving, and cognitive decline, to name a few. And in receiving these awards from NIA, there's an agreement to a spirit and an ideal, one of diversity and inclusion, human dignity, and human regard. So Dr. Ballsbury went over this for just a bit, but I'll go talk about it a little bit more. For those that are not aware, when the NIA makes an award to researchers that are studying Alzheimer's disease with human subjects, there's a declaration of inclusion in the forms of plans for enrolling women and racial and ethnic populations like African Americans into the study. These plans are important because women and racial and ethnic groups have been historically underrepresented in NIH-funded clinical research. So, moving on, peer review committees provide a rating for these plans and the overall research application, and there's a shared responsibility for this research that is funded between researcher and NIA staff member to keep the spirit of inclusion alive. One of implementation for the researcher and the other of holding to accountabilities for the NIA program staff member. To tell you that recruitment and retention of African Americans into NIA-funded clinical trials continues to be a challenge, even though these plans are in place, probably comes as no surprise. But what might be shocking is that the intent among us stakeholders is there. Just like the American Revolutionary cohort, the original spirit of this Alzheimer's research that NIA supports demands a plan. But similar to the rush to move to natural resources to the world trade market that forced early Americans to make rash decisions about equality, the pressure of generating and publishing research results that combat Alzheimer's may force these researchers and program officials to forget about these enrollment plans and the original spirit of inclusion and diversity. And just like a United States without a respect for human dignity and human regard, can NIA-funded Alzheimer's research without diversity and inclusion ever be successful? And given that the Alzheimer's Association reports that African Americans are twice as likely to develop this disease, can research findings that omit African Americans ever be complete? And the silence among us that are accountable, researcher and NIH staff, has up until recently been concerning. Much like Ted Turner's idea, many of us, and yes, I include myself, have chosen to say little to nothing in hopes that this will work itself out. Let other people deal with it and decide how to handle it. Move on with what we know about who wants to participate in these studies. Publish the results, pat ourselves on the back. Don't get me wrong, understanding the ins and outs of the cultural distinctions that Dr. Dilworth Anderson cites in her framework, it's not easy work. Recruitment and participation are behaviors that are influenced by a number of factors. As she states, there needs to be commitment and resources linked to these efforts, plans to implement strategies and plans to evaluate that work. I think that's why she sees this as a science. This isn't a goodwill piece of what we do. It's not a feel-good activity. It's a science because of the rigor and resources needed to understand the factors that might predict recruitment and participation. I also think about other voices that combat the silence here. Community activists like Norman Seay that keep the spirit of the civil rights movement alive. NIA Deputy Director Marie A. Bernard, who has led a charge at NIH to adopt an inclusion policy that clarifies reasons for excluding persons from research studies and requires a report in that progress report for how this enrollment is going with the research program. Also, NIA's Dr. Cerise Elliott and Nina Silverberg, who are both shepherding a funding opportunity announcement for set-aside funds. This is a sure sign of NIA's interest to gather investigators, folks like Dr. Joyce Ballsbury, who are thinking critically about including African Americans in Alzheimer's research. In short, I think there's great hope. In his book, Founding Brothers, Joseph Ellis, the book I mentioned earlier, says that hindsight allows us to identify that the silence around slavery, which is a lack of human regard and human dignity, is the central and defining problem of American history. That by being passive and silent on the issue led to a circumstance where, and I quote, legal and political institutions of the developing U.S. government became entwined in compromises with slavery's persistence. Our Alzheimer's disease research enterprise is developing. And there has been silence on planned activities for diversity, inclusion, and equity. Study populations like diversity and researchers conducting this work, conducting this science, are too often not African American. American history tells us that the more that our enterprise develops without diversity and inclusion as a central factor that responds to some specific accountabilities, the more difficult it will be to address this shortcoming down the line. Our institutions, which are represented here, Alzheimer's disease centers, must get involved to help meet these challenges. This is important because, in my opinion, how can you address Alzheimer's as a public health priority when those most affected, African Americans, are rarely included as study participants or researchers? I'm gonna say that again. This is important because, in my opinion, how can you address Alzheimer's as a public health priority when those most affected, African Americans, are rarely included as study participants or researchers? We all can learn from the endless cadre of freedom fighters and civil rights workers like Norman Seay that stayed a course to address America's shortcomings related to equality, planning and commitment. And when faced with challenge and silence around issues related to diversity, innovation and creativity to reshape our message. But being silent is not an option. Not anymore. And as our voices become louder, with Dr. Ballsbury's excellent lecture, our networking opportunities later this evening, our timely workshop tomorrow championed by Dr. John Morris, let's not fall in the usual traps of tribalism and petty competition. Let's remain open to that original spirit, that original American spirit, that original spirit in the applications of equality, community, and a respect for diversity among our network and for Alzheimer's disease research. Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me here. Congrats to us all for a wonderful lecture.